The air over Tokyo on the night of March 9, 1945, was cold, thin, and carried the metallic scent of a city holding its breath. Below the frozen stars, the sprawling metropolis was a creature of shadows and whispers, its wooden heart shrouded in a blackout that felt more like a prayer than a precaution. On a rooftop in the Omori district, a place chosen for its clear view of the southern approaches, Kenji Tanaka, a senior aeronautical engineer from the Nakajima Aircraft Company, pulled his worn wool coat tighter against a wind that carried the chill of the distant sea. He was 42 years old, a man whose life was governed by the precise and unforgiving laws of physics. He understood stress tolerances, airfoil dynamics, and the thermodynamics of a piston engine with an intimacy that left little room for the chaotic variables of human emotion. For months, he and his colleagues in the highest echelons of Japanese aviation design had treated the American intelligence reports about a new bomber as a kind of professional joke, a piece of fanciful propaganda. The aircraft, designated the B-29 Superfortress, was, by their calculations, an engineering absurdity. The specifications they reviewed were not merely ambitious, they bordered on the fantastical. A fully pressurized crew compartment for sustained high-altitude flight was a known theoretical concept, but to implement it on a production scale for a plane of that size was a nightmare of seals, structural reinforcement, and complex life support systems. A gross weight of over 130,000 pounds pushed the known limits of airframe strength and landing gear technology. Powering such a behemoth required 4 engines, each supposedly producing over 2,200 horsepower, a figure that implied a mastery of metallurgy and supercharger technology that Tanaka's own industry, starved of chromium and nickel, could only dream of. Most damningly, its operational range, sufficient to strike the homeland from the newly captured Mariana Islands, a round trip of over 3,000 miles, suggested a fuel efficiency and engine reliability that defied their own hard-won, bitter experience. Tanaka and the finest engineering minds of the empire, men who had crafted the elegant and deadly Mitsubishi Zero, had run the calculations repeatedly. They had factored in the resource requirements, the tooling tolerances, the sheer industrial logistics of material procurement and assembly. Their conclusion, presented to the military high command, was unanimous and unshakable. Such an aircraft was a practical impossibility. To build a handful of delicate prototypes was one thing. To manufacture and field a strategic fleet of them was a fiction as outlandish as any Hollywood movie. The decadent, individualistic Americans, a people they were taught, were obsessed with comfort and leisure, surely lacked the national will, the centralized discipline, and the spiritual focus for such a monumental undertaking. Their factories, the propaganda films assured them, were chaotic pits of labor disputes, their workers lazy and unmotivated, their society a fragile construct of competing interests. What Kenji Tanaka saw in that moment, as the air raid sirens finally began their mournful, belated wail across the sleeping city, was the violent and absolute refutation of his entire professional life. It defied 12 years of carefully curated indoctrination, a lifetime of engineering certainty, and the very laws of industrial reality as he and his nation knew them. It was not one aircraft, a lone reconnaissance plane, or a dozen bombers probing their defenses. It was a river, a celestial river of polished aluminum flowing in from the dark, infinite expanse of the Pacific, each machine glinting coldly under the high moonlight. It was a procession of hundreds, a constellation of man-made stars moving with unnatural purpose. They were so numerous that the drone of their individual Wright Cyclone engines merged into a single, terrifying vibration, a physical presence that resonated through the rooftop concrete and deep into his bones, a sound that was not heard but felt. He could not count them. The attempt was futile. They were a swarm, an unending chain of industrial might, a conveyor belt in the sky. The mathematics of defeat were written in fire and silver across the heavens above him. This single discovery proved the war was already lost, not by soldiers in muddy trenches or sailors on burning ships, but by anonymous engineers, by rivet gun-wielding women, and by factory managers thousands of miles away, in a land he could not imagine. The deeply ingrained belief in the B-29's impossibility was not born of simple arrogance or wishful thinking, but of a sober, if flawed, assessment of Japan's own industrial reality. The empire of the rising sun had entered the 20th century with a ferocious, desperate ambition to modernize, to drag itself from a feudal past and take its place among the Western powers that had humiliated it a generation before. By many measures, it had achieved miracles of compressed development. Its naval architects, in a stunning feat of design and construction, had produced the Yamato and Musashi, the largest and most powerful battleships ever to sail the seas. Its own aeronautical engineers, brilliant men like Tanaka and the legendary Jiro Horikoshi, had created the Mitsubishi A6M0, an aircraft that, in the opening year of the Pacific War, was the undisputed master of the sky, a symbol of Japanese ingenuity and dominance. But these spectacular triumphs, celebrated as proof of the nation's innate genius, concealed a fatal systemic flaw. Japan's industrial base was a finely crafted, artisanal enterprise, not a behemoth of standardized mass production. It was a nation of immensely skilled craftsmen whose pride was in the perfection of the individual unit, not the relentless output of the assembly line. Every Zero fighter was a masterpiece of lightweight design and maneuverability, but it was built largely by hand, with tolerances measured by the keen eye and steady hand of the worker, not the infallible precision of a machine tool. Rivets were placed with artistic care, components were filed and fitted individually. This approach could produce jewels of engineering, but it could not produce volume. In 1943, at the absolute peak of its wartime efforts, with its economy strained to the breaking point, Japan managed to produce just over 16,000 aircraft of all types. In that same calendar year, the United States, while fighting a two-front war and supplying its allies, produced over 85,000. The numbers, cold and stripped of patriotic fervor, revealed a truth no propaganda could hide for long. The resources were the true measure of the war. Japan was an island nation, a beautiful but resource-poor country, desperately short of every critical war material. High-quality bauxite for aluminum had to be shipped through treacherous, submarine-infested waters. High-grade iron ore was scarce. Tungsten, chromium, nickel, molybdenum, the essential ingredients for high-strength steel alloys, were almost non-existent. And most critically, oil was the empire's lifeblood, and the American submarine campaign was closing the arteries. The supply was dwindling to a contaminated trickle. Every gallon was precious, hoarded and rationed with excruciating care for the final decisive battle. The military indoctrination that Tanaka and his entire generation had absorbed was built on the powerful, seductive idea of spiritual superiority. Yamato Damashii, the unique Japanese spirit, a combination of courage, daring, and unwavering loyalty, could overcome any material disadvantage. A single Japanese soldier, they were told from childhood, was worth 10 soft-bellied Americans. Their pilots were modern-day samurai, their devotion to the divine emperor a spiritual weapon more potent than any machine. The propaganda that flooded the newspapers and radio waves painted Americans as a mongrel race, soft, materialistic, and fundamentally incapable of the sacrifice required for total war. Their society was a decadent mess of jazz music, Hollywood fantasies, selfish individualism, and constant labor strikes. How could such a people, a culture so focused on individual comfort and fleeting pleasure, possibly organize the collective will and marshal the resources to build a weapon as staggeringly complex as the Superfortress? The military command assured the nation that the enemy was formidable in material, but brittle in spirit. Their supply lines were stretched across the vast Pacific, their resolve weak. The stunning initial victories of World War II seem to confirm this comforting narrative. The fall of Singapore, the sinking of the British battleships Prince of Wales and the Repulse, the lightning-fast conquest of the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. It all fed a national mythology of Japanese invincibility. But while Japan was winning spectacular battles, America was quietly winning the war of production. In the vast flat plains of Kansas, in a place called Wichita, the Boeing Company had constructed a factory, Plant 2, under a single roof that covered 63 acres. In Georgia, near Atlanta, the Bell Aircraft Corporation built another, even larger, specifically for the B-29. These were not mere factories in the Japanese sense. They were climate-controlled, self-contained industrial cities employing tens of thousands of workers around the clock. Many of these workers were women personified by the cultural icon Rosie the Riveter, who had never before held a wrench or a rivet gun but were trained with ruthless efficiency. They were organized not around the venerated master craftsman, but around the cold, impersonal logic of the moving assembly line, a concept perfected by the American automobile industry. The design of the B-29 itself was a leap of an entire technological generation. It featured 4 remote-controlled gun turrets, aimed by a primitive but effective analog computer, a Norden bomb sight of exquisite precision, and the revolutionary, fully pressurized crew compartment that allowed it to fly in the thin, cold air above 30,000 feet, beyond the effective range of most Japanese anti-aircraft fire and the struggling interceptors that tried to meet them. To Japanese engineers like Tanaka, who fought daily battles for a few extra kilograms of duralumin to build a fighter wing, the material requirements for a single Superfortress were astronomical. Each one required over 55,000 pounds of aluminum, more than 10 miles of electrical wiring, and 4 Wright R-3350 duplex cyclone radial engines, each a marvel of engineering with 18 cylinders and a 2-stage supercharger, a level of complexity they could barely imagine, let alone replicate. The scale of deception was about to become clear, not on a battlefield of honor, but in the slow, grinding, humiliating revelation of what it meant to fight a nation that had industrialized not just for war, but for effortless abundance. The war for men like Tanaka was a desperate, heroic struggle for scarce resources. The war for their American counterparts was a logistical problem of managing an almost embarrassing surplus. This was the fundamental, catastrophic miscalculation that would lead him to that lonely rooftop in Tokyo, watching an impossible silver river drift inexorably across the moonlit sky, each droplet a flying machine that was a testament to an industrial power he had been trained his entire life to hold in contempt. The months following the great firebombing of Tokyo, which incinerated 16 square miles of the city and killed over 100,000 people in a single night, were a descent into a waking nightmare of scarcity, fear, and destruction. For Kenji Tanaka, the engineer, the world became a series of unsolvable equations. The Nakajima factory in Musashino was hit repeatedly by precision daylight raids. The carefully calibrated machine tools, the irreplaceable heart of their production capacity, many of them imported from Germany and even America before the war, were twisted into blackened scrap. Skilled workers, men he had known for years, were killed in the raids or conscripted as cannon fodder for the Army's hopeless island garrisons. He saw brilliant designs for advanced fighters, aircraft like the jet-powered Kika or the heavily armed Ki-84 that could have challenged the Americans on equal terms, but they remained phantoms on paper. There was not enough aluminum for the airframes, not enough cobalt for the engines, not enough skilled labor for the assembly, and not enough high-octane fuel to even properly test the few prototypes they managed to build. His own family's rations were cut again, and then again. Their meals devolved into a thin, watery soup of vegetable scraps and a few precious grains of rice, bulked out with soybeans or even sawdust. The spiritual superiority that was supposed to be their greatest weapon felt like a cruel, hollow mockery in the face of their children's empty stomachs, and the constant high-altitude drone of the enemy reconnaissance planes they could no longer challenge. In late July of 1945, with the Allied invasion of the homeland looming, Tanaka was sent on a mission to inspect a coastal defense installation near Chiba. It was during this trip that his life and his entire perception of the world took a sudden, irreversible turn. An American fighter sweep, a squadron of P-51 Mustangs from Iwo Jima, appeared as if from nowhere, their silver wings flashing in the sun. They strafed the train he was on with terrifying precision. In the chaos of splintering wood and shattering glass, he was thrown into a waterlogged ditch, his legs snapping with a sickening crack. He awoke to a world of muted sounds and the unfamiliar antiseptic smell of disinfectant. He was in a makeshift American field hospital, a tent city erected with astonishing speed. The first thing he noticed was the quiet, unhurried efficiency of the medics. The second was the rich, intoxicating scent of brewing coffee, a fragrance he had not experienced in nearly 5 years. A young doctor, a man no older than his own nephew, set his broken leg with a calm, detached professionalism that was profoundly unnerving. They gave him a shot of morphine, and the blinding pain receded into a distant, manageable fog. This was his first contact with the demon enemy, and it was not the brutal subhuman caricature from the propaganda posters. It was organized, overwhelmingly well-supplied, and disturbingly humane. From there, he was transported to a holding facility on recently captured Okinawa, and then onto a large transport ship, one of literally thousands in the American fleet, that choked the island's harbors. The journey itself was the beginning of his re-education. On the ship, he was quartered in a large hold with hundreds of other Japanese prisoners of war, a miserable mix of shell-shocked soldiers from the Okinawa campaign and a few non-combatants like himself, classified as civilian specialists. 3 times a day, they were given meals. The first time the trays were passed down, Tanaka thought it must be a mistake, perhaps a special ration for the wounded. There were thick, soft slices of white bread, something he hadn't seen since before the war with China. There was a small pat of real butter and a tiny container of sweet strawberry jam. There was even a piece of sausage. The prisoners, gaunt and starved, ate in a stunned, reverent silence. They ate slowly, carefully, hoarding every crumb as if it were gold. But then the exact same meal came again for lunch and again for dinner. Day after day, the supply seemed as endless as the ocean itself. The American guards, young men with easygoing smiles and a casual slouch, would often take a few bites of a sandwich and, with a flick of the wrist, throw the rest overboard into the sea. Tanaka watched one guard, bored on watch, toss a nearly full, perfect red apple into the churning waves. He felt a surge of white-hot rage, followed instantly by a profound and humiliating confusion. An apple. A single perfect apple was a luxury his own children had not enjoyed in over a year. It would have been a precious gift, a treasure. Here, it was trash. The full, sickening realization hit him. They had been fighting an enemy who could afford to waste more than his own nation could produce in total. Upon arrival in San Francisco, they were put on a train. Tanaka, his leg now in a heavy, expertly applied plaster cast, stared out the window for days as the train moved east. The sheer, empty scale of the country was the first blow. The vast, fertile valleys of California, the enormous farms that stretched to a cloudless horizon, the solid, well-maintained houses, each with its own car. But it was the other trains that truly broke his engineer's mind. They would sit at a crossing, waiting for a freight train to pass, and it would pass for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, sometimes 20 minutes, an endless, thundering procession of cars carrying coal, lumber, steel, tanks, automobiles, and mountains of what looked like golden grain. He tried to calculate the tonnage. He tried to estimate the logistical coordination required to move this much material. The numbers became meaningless, astronomical. It was a demonstration of power so overwhelming, so casually displayed, that it felt more like a geological force than a human industry. Their destination was a camp in the high desert of Utah, a place called Camp Kearns. It was a purpose-built city of barracks laid out in a perfect soulless grid. Here, the process of ideological erosion accelerated into a landslide. The prisoners were issued new clothes, sturdy work garments, and boots that were warmer and of better quality than his own best engineer's suit back in Tokyo. They were assigned bunks with clean sheets and 2 thick woolen blankets. The camp library had thousands of books, in both English and Japanese. There were even movie nights showing American films that depicted a life of impossible comfort, convenience, and romantic silliness. A fellow prisoner, a young, fiercely patriotic pilot named Lieutenant Ito, who had been shot down over Saipan, remained defiantly resistant. "It is a trick," he would hiss at night in the barracks, his voice trembling with conviction. "A deception. They are trying to soften us, to make us forget our duty to the Emperor. This is a psychological weapon." Tanaka wanted to believe him. It would have been easier to believe in a lie. But the evidence was too concrete, too relentless, too mundane. The food was the most powerful weapon of all. Every day they were served meals with a caloric count that would have been a feast for a general in the Imperial Japanese Army. Beef stew, roasted chicken, potatoes, fresh milk, and coffee with unlimited sugar. Tanaka, who had been gaunt and thin, his ribs showing, began to gain weight. His skin lost its sallow, jaundiced color. The camp doctors monitored their health with charts and graphs, providing vitamin supplements and even dental care. This single discovery, the casual, systemic, and deep-seated nature of American abundance, proved the war was already lost. The enemy was not just defeating them in battle, they were nurturing their defeated enemies back to health with an offhand largesse that was more devastating than any bomb. One day, Tanaka was assigned to light duty in the camp's sprawling motor pool. He watched as American mechanics, young men chewing gum and listening to jazz on the radio, worked on jeeps and trucks. He saw them diagnose a faulty carburetor on a 2.5-ton truck. They did not attempt to disassemble and repair it. They simply unbolted the old one and took a brand-new replacement from a wooden crate filled with dozens of identical brand-new carburetors, each still wrapped in thick, greasy wax paper. The old one was tossed onto a scrap heap. Later, Tanaka walked over to the heap. It was a mountain, a small mountain of discarded parts. Tires with plenty of tread, spark plugs, gaskets, entire engine blocks, radiators, transmissions. In Japan, such a pile would have been a national strategic reserve, guarded day and night. Each part would have been painstakingly repaired, machined, and reused until it literally disintegrated. In that moment, watching a young mechanic carelessly throw away a perfectly good wrench because it had a small patch of rust on the handle, Tanaka understood with sickening clarity that they had been lied to about everything. This was not a nation on the brink of collapse from the strains of war. This was a nation that had not even begun to feel the strain. The evidence mounted daily, a relentless, unceasing tide that eroded the foundations of their entire worldview. It was not a single dramatic event, but 1,000 small, irrefutable, and often mundane facts that, taken together, painted a picture of absolute and insurmountable disparity. The camp was a microcosm of the American system, a system built not on scarcity and conservation, but on surplus and consumption. Tanaka, with his analytical engineer's mind, began to document it, first in his head, then in a small cheap notebook he acquired from the camp canteen. He noted the sheer criminal volume of food waste. After each meal, the prisoners' leftovers were collected in large bins. But the truly staggering amount came from the separate mess halls for the American GIs. He saw guards scraping entire barely touched plates of food into the trash. He calculated, based on the number of bins and their approximate weight, that the food discarded at Camp Kearns in a single day could have fed his entire neighborhood in Omori for a week. The mathematics of defeat were written in discarded bread crusts, half-eaten pork chops, and untouched bowls of peaches. What happened next shattered 70 years of national indoctrination, the entire Meiji Restoration's desperate, prideful effort to build a nation that could stand on equal footing with the West. To help with his English lessons, Tanaka was given access to a stack of American magazines. He picked up a copy of Life magazine, dated May 14, 1945. The cover showed a smiling, confident American soldier. Inside, the pages themselves were a weapon more powerful than a battleship. They were thick, glossy, and filled with brilliant, vibrant color photographs that seemed to leap off the page. There were articles about the war in Europe ending, but these were surrounded by something far more shocking: advertisements. Dozens of full-page color advertisements for goods and services that had become distant memories or unattainable fantasies in Japan. An ad for a deep green Chrysler automobile, with the seductive promise of brand-new models available as soon as the war was over. An ad for a General Electric refrigerator showing a beaming housewife pulling out a cornucopia of fresh food, milk, eggs, butter, fruit, from its brightly lit interior. There were ads for Parker fountain pens, Elgin wristwatches, Coca-Cola, Camel cigarettes, and life insurance policies from the Prudential Company. Tanaka stared, mesmerized, at a massive 2-page spread for Caterpillar tractors, showing immense yellow machines carving highways out of mountainsides. The ad wasn't aimed at the government or the military. It was aimed at civilian construction companies, promising them the tools to build the post-war world. This magazine was not propaganda designed for prisoners. It was a periodical for the enemy's civilian population. It depicted a society not just enduring a war, but impatiently waiting for the war to end so they could resume their interrupted spree of consumption. His homeland was melting down its sacred temple bells for bronze and asking citizens to donate their wedding rings and kitchen pans for the war effort, while America was worried about which brand of refrigerator to buy after the inevitable victory. Lieutenant Ito, the defiant pilot, saw him reading the magazine. He snatched it from Tanaka's hands, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Lies, all of it, Hollywood tricks. They print these just for us, to break our spirit, he shouted, his voice cracking. An older prisoner, a quiet sergeant major named Okubo, who had fought in the long, brutal war in China, simply shook his head slowly. "Ito-san," he said, his voice heavy with a profound resignation. "Look at their shoes. Just look at the guards' shoes." Everyone in the barracks paused their conversations. They looked at the guards' boots. They were thick, supple leather, well-made, and sturdy. When a guard's boots wore out, he was simply issued a new pair from a supply room filled with hundreds of boxes. The prisoners themselves had been issued boots that were superior in every way to the cheap, split leather and canvas shoes they had been given in the Imperial Army. Sergeant Okubo continued, his voice barely a whisper. "In Manchuria, in winter, we had to stuff our boots with rags to keep our feet from freezing. A good pair of boots was worth more than a medal. These people, they have mountains of boots. A country that can give every soldier a perfect pair of boots and then have enough left over for its prisoners, that country cannot lose a war of production." The scale of deception, the one perpetrated not by the Americans but by their own leaders, was becoming terrifyingly, humiliatingly clear. The final crushing blow for Tanaka the engineer, the one that shattered the last remnants of his professional pride, came through an unexpected channel. One of the camp's administrative officers was a Captain Miller, an older scholarly man who had been an engineering professor at a university before the war. He learned of Tanaka's background and took a quiet professional interest in him. He was not an interrogator seeking military secrets, but a fellow engineer, genuinely curious about the Japanese perspective. One afternoon, he invited Tanaka into his office. He unrolled a set of crisp, detailed blueprints on his desk. Tanaka's breath caught in his throat. It was a complete schematic for the B-29 Superfortress. "I thought you might be interested in this," Miller said, his tone neutral, academic. For over an hour, Tanaka pored over the drawings, his engineer's hands trembling slightly as they traced the lines. He saw the intricate, brilliant design of the turbo-superchargers, the genius of the central fire control system that allowed a single gunner to control multiple turrets, the sheer structural audacity of the pressurized fuselage. It was everything the fragmented intelligence reports had hinted at, and more. It was a magnificent, revolutionary piece of engineering. "We could have designed this," Tanaka said softly, a statement of professional pride mixed with a deep, bottomless sorrow. "Perhaps," Miller said gently, "but could you have built it?" He then slid a single piece of paper across the desk. It was a typed production report from the Boeing Wichita plant for the month of August 1944. Tanaka's eyes scanned the columns of numbers. His mind, trained to think in terms of production schedules, resource allocation, and labor hours, struggled to process the figures. They seemed to be typos. The report stated that this single factory was producing an average of 4.5 completed B-29 bombers every single day, 4.5 impossible aircraft every 24 hours, from just one of 4 major assembly plants dedicated to the program. Tanaka looked up at Miller, his face pale, his composure finally breaking. He felt a profound sense of shame, not as a prisoner of war, but as an engineer who had been so fundamentally, so catastrophically wrong in his most basic professional judgments. "How?" he whispered, the sound barely audible. Miller leaned back in his chair, sensing the man's intellectual surrender. "In Japan, I'm told you have master craftsmen. Here, we have a system. We have millions of ordinary people, women, farmers, shopkeepers, who used to sell shoes, and we have a system that allows them to build extraordinary things. We standardized every part, down to the last rivet. We designed machines whose only job was to build other machines. We didn't need master craftsmen for every task. We needed one to design the system, and then hundreds of thousands of ordinary people to run it." In that moment, Tanaka understood with the force of a physical blow that they had not been fighting the American people. They had been fighting the American system. They had been fighting the ghost of Henry Ford and his assembly line, the ghost of Frederick Taylor and his scientific management, and a continent-spanning logistical network that operated with the predictable, remorseless power of a law of nature. They had brought their samurai spirit to a fight against a spreadsheet. The war had been over for years. They just hadn't realized it yet. What they witnessed next, in the form of a simple production report on a professor's desk, would haunt them for decades. It was the simple, brutal, and irrefutable arithmetic of modern industrial warfare. The psychological transformation was not a sudden, dramatic epiphany, but a slow, painful, grinding surrender to an overwhelming and undeniable reality. For Kenji Tanaka, the engineer's pride, his faith in his own analytical abilities, was the last great bastion to fall. For weeks after seeing the B-29 blueprints and the horrifying production numbers, he was quiet, withdrawn, a ghost moving through the camp's daily routine. He performed his light duties mechanically, his mind a constant churning whirlwind of cognitive dissonance. Everything he had been taught, every core belief about his nation's unique spirit, its inherent superiority, and the enemy's decadent weakness, was not just wrong, it was a comprehensive, catastrophic lie. The shame was a physical weight that stooped his shoulders and made it difficult to breathe. He felt the acute shame of his own professional ignorance, or the smug, academic arrogance with which he and his colleagues had dismissed the intelligence reports as impossible fantasy. But deeper than that, a much heavier burden, was the shame of realizing the immense, pointless, and tragic sacrifice of his own people. The kamikaze pilots, young men his nephew's age, diving their planes into the American fleet. The starving soldiers on isolated, God-forsaken islands, fighting to the last man with bayonets and sharpened sticks. The women and children in the fire-bombed cities, dying in agony for a cause that had been mathematically doomed from the very start. In the small diary he kept, he poured out his confusion and despair. October 11th, 1945. Today I finally understood the true nature of this war. We believe spirit is a sword, sharp and pure. The Americans have made spirit into a factory. Their spirit is not in the heart of the individual soldier, but in the organization, the system, the assembly line. It is a collective spirit that moves mountains of iron and drinks rivers of oil. It is a spirit that builds 4.5 impossible bombers a day. How do you fight a factory with a prayer? How do you destroy a logistical system with raw courage alone? We have been like children, bringing beautiful, handmade wooden toys to a battle of giants, forged from steel. The transformation manifested in different, deeply personal ways among the other prisoners. Lieutenant Ito, the fiery, patriotic pilot, finally broke during a newsreel shown one evening in the mess hall. The film showed footage of the U.S. Navy's Task Force 58 at sea. The camera panned across a vast, endless fleet, with dozens of aircraft carriers and their screening flotilla of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers stretching to the horizon. It then cut to scenes of the Grumman factory on Long Island, the Iron Works, showing F-6F Hellcat fighters rolling off the assembly line literally every hour. Ito watched, his face ashen, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. Then, to the shock of everyone, he began to weep. Not quiet, dignified tears, but great racking sobs of despair. He cried not for his lost plane or his dead comrades, but for the sheer, hopeless, soul-crushing impossibility of it all. He had been a proud samurai of the sky, believing his skill and spirit made him invincible. But he was just one man in one fragile, hand-crafted machine. The enemy could produce 100 more just like it before his wreckage had even cooled on the ocean floor. Others, like the older, wiser Sergeant Major Okubo, found a quiet, almost serene sense of peace in the final acceptance of defeat. He had seen the pointless brutality of the war in China and had long harbored private doubts about the wisdom of the High Command in Tokyo. For him, the evidence of American abundance was not a shock, but a grim confirmation of his deepest fears. He stopped resisting and focused on learning. He spent every spare hour in the camp library, not reading novels, but meticulously studying American agricultural techniques and methods of industrial organization. "The war is over, Tanaka-san," he said one evening as they sat outside the barracks, watching the desert sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. "Our duty now is not to die for the Emperor, but to live for Japan. We must learn so we can rebuild. We cannot let our children make the same mistakes. We cannot let them believe that spirit is enough to defeat a moving assembly line." The humiliation through kindness was a constant, subtle, and incredibly effective psychological pressure. When a prisoner fell ill with dysentery or pneumonia, he was taken to the camp hospital, a facility that was cleaner, better equipped, and better staffed than the finest military hospital in Tokyo. American doctors and nurses, some of whom had brothers or husbands fighting in the Pacific, treated them with the same professional care they would give to their own soldiers. This compassion was more disorienting and corrosive to their ideology than cruelty would have been. Cruelty would have fed their narrative of a barbaric, inhuman enemy. Kindness destroyed it. It forced them to see their captors not as demons, but as ordinary people, cogs in a system that was not only immensely powerful, but in many ways surprisingly decent. The ultimate irrefutable symbol of this transformation was the prisoner's own physical health. After 6 months in the camp, almost every man had gained between 20 and 30 pounds. They were healthier than they had been in years, their bodies recovering from the chronic malnutrition of life in wartime Japan. Their letters home, which were censored by the camp authorities, began to change dramatically in tone. Initial letters were filled with stiff, patriotic defiance and hollow reassurances. Later letters were filled with coded, desperate pleas for their families to be safe and strange, unbelievable descriptions of their daily life. "Today we had meat again," a soldier might write, knowing his family back home was surviving on soybeans and seaweed. "Please do not worry for my health. The provisions here are adequate. That single, carefully chosen word, adequate, was a universe of understatement, a quiet, desperate admission of a reality so profoundly different from the one at home that it could not be described directly without sounding like a madman or a traitor. For Tanaka, the final turning point from shame to something else, a kind of detached, analytical curiosity, the engineer's mind reasserting itself, came when Captain Miller gave him a book. It was a dense technical manual on the principles of statistical quality control, a new and revolutionary technique being pioneered in American war factories by a man named W. Edwards Deming. He read it with a feverish, all-consuming intensity. It was a philosophy of manufacturing that was utterly alien to him. It was not about the master craftsman checking his own work at the end of the process. It was about using the cold logic of mathematics and probability to control the quality of an entire production line in real time, to minimize defects, and to create a feedback loop for constant, incremental improvement. It was the secret ingredient. It was the intellectual software that ran the mighty hardware of the American factories. In that moment, his hatred for the enemy, his shame for his nation, all of it was replaced by a powerful, burning desire to understand. He was no longer a prisoner of war. He had become an unwilling student in the world's most effective and brutal industrial classroom. He and the thousands of men around him were the living, breathing proof of their nation's utter defeat, but they were also, unknowingly, becoming the seeds of its eventual, astonishing rebirth. The lasting impact of this forced, immersive education began the very moment men like Kenji Tanaka stepped off the crowded troop ships back onto the scorched, radioactive earth of their homeland in late 1945 and early 1946. They returned to a nation not just defeated in a military sense, but spiritually and physically shattered. The great cities were vast plains of rubble and ash. The economy had ceased to exist, and the people were starving, disoriented, and demoralized. But these thousands of returning prisoners of war brought back something more valuable than any shipment of foreign aid. A new, clear-eyed perspective, born from the undeniable, overwhelming evidence they had witnessed in captivity. They had seen the inner workings of the system that had crushed them, and they were uniquely, if painfully, equipped to understand how to rebuild. While other leaders, the holdovers from the old regime, spoke vaguely of reviving the Japanese spirit, men like Tanaka and Sergeant Major Okubo spoke with a new, urgent vocabulary about reviving Japanese industry, but on an entirely new model based on efficiency and quality. They had been lied to about everything, and now they were among the few who were completely free to pursue the hard, empirical truth. Tanaka, with his impeccable engineering background and his new, almost heretical knowledge of American production methods, became a sought-after consultant in the chaos of early Reconstruction. He did not work for the discredited government ministries, but for the small, scrappy, emerging companies that were rising from the ashes, companies with names like Honda and Sony, that would one day become global giants. He spoke of statistical quality control, of logistics, of supply chain management, and of the critical importance of the system over the individual craftsman. He told stories that must have sounded like fables, stories of the Camp Kearns motor pool, of the endless crates of brand-new spare parts, of the American philosophy of routine replacement over painstaking repair. He described the Life magazine and its dazzling vision of a prosperous consumer society, arguing with a passion that surprised even himself that Japan's future lay not in military conquest, but in manufacturing high-quality products that people around the world wanted and needed to buy. Sergeant Major Okubo, the old pragmatic soldier, returned to his family's small, struggling farm. He applied the lessons he had so diligently learned from the American agricultural books in the camp library, experimenting with crop rotation, soil enrichment, and the rudiments of mechanization. His farm, against all odds, became a model of productivity in his prefecture, a small-scale, living demonstration of how to apply new knowledge to ancient problems. The central historical irony was profound and inescapable. The American military had spent billions of dollars and the lives of tens of thousands of its young men to develop and deploy the B-29 Superfortress for the sole purpose of destroying Japanese industry. And yet, in the process, by taking thousands of prisoners, they had inadvertently and unknowingly trained a new cadre of Japanese industrial and agricultural leaders in the very methods that had made America the most powerful nation on earth. The lessons were absorbed and applied with a ferocious, focused intensity born of national humiliation and a desperate desire to survive and recover. The Japanese did not simply copy American methods. With their own cultural emphasis on discipline, detail, and collective effort, they adapted and perfected them. The principles of statistical quality control, which Kenji Tanaka had first encountered in a dusty textbook in a Utah prison camp, evolved into the world-renowned Kaizen philosophy of continuous improvement, a cornerstone of Japan's spectacular post-war economic miracle. The nation that had been brought to its knees by an enemy who could afford to waste more than they could produce transformed itself in the space of a single generation into the most efficient, quality-conscious, and waste-averse industrial power on the planet. The final ironic observation about this chapter of history is that the B-29 Superfortress ultimately accomplished two distinct missions. Its first intended mission was to burn down the cities of a rival empire, and it did so with a terrifying, apocalyptic efficiency. Its second, wholly unintended mission was to deliver a crushing, undeniable, and ultimately transformative lesson in the brutal mathematics of modern industrial power. It was a lesson that humiliated its recipients, shattered their most cherished beliefs, and then, paradoxically, gave them the intellectual tools to rebuild their nation and become one of America's strongest allies, and, for a time, its fiercest economic competitor. The sky over Tokyo, once filled with a silver river of death, became the symbol of a new national ambition, a sky filled not with bombers, but with the commercial aircraft that carried Japanese cameras, cars, and electronics to every corner of the globe. Kenji Tanaka lived to be a very old man, well into his 90s. He saw his nation rise from the ashes to become an economic superpower, a peaceful and prosperous society. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, he would tell his grandchildren stories, not of the terror of the war, but of a strange interlude in a prison camp in a desert halfway around the world. He would describe, his eyes distant, the unbelievable taste of white bread with butter and sweet strawberry jam, the shocking sight of a mountain of perfectly good, discarded tires, and the glossy, magical pages of a magazine that showed a life of impossible, casual abundance. He would tell them that the most important lessons in life, and in the life of a nation, are not always learned in glorious victory, but in the complete, humble, and total acceptance of a devastating truth. The war, he would say, his voice a soft whisper, was not won by soldiers, but by the system, and the future would always belong to whoever could build the better one.